Well, apocalypse in the national capital, that's what analysts are calling this, and that by any benchmark would be an understatement, given where the pollution levels currently stand. We believe that as per the data that's available on various indicators of the CPCB, the weather today, the conditions today, the pollution conditions today are just a wee bit better than what they were yesterday. But even today, when they're apparently better, the levels, the AQI levels as far as PM 2.5 is concerned are varying between 300 and 600 micrograms per cubic meter. And just to put that in context for you, the WHO prescribed guideline levels for PM 2.5 is as low as 25 micrograms per cubic meter. Just to give you a sense, that's of course the data, just to give you a sense visually how Delhi is currently looking, I'll request my camera person just to pan a wee bit on my left. That's of course the little of what you can see is Raisina Hills, that's the South Block, completely hazy at this point. There's a blanket of smog, a very distinct, a very cognizable layer of dust that has accumulated, that has dropped, that is sitting currently on the national capital region, leading to a huge cry out in terms of the implications for what it has for our lungs, for our health. Again, big concerns being raised here. The government on its part has, at least on the face of it, appears to be on a war footing. They've announced various measures, or even formula, mind you, could be making a comeback. We're looking at measures such as increasing of fees, as parking fees by as much as 4 times. There's a call made out for increasing the frequency of Delhi metro trains. Construction activity has been stopped. But what's critical here is that these are ad hoc measures. These are interim measures, and by no stretch of imagination, is not a part of a longer, broader strategy for tackling of air pollution. And to in fact discuss those issues with us, the coughing, clearly, it is taking a toll, the weather conditions, the pollution levels at this point. But joining us to discuss the reasons behind the coughing, the reasons behind other ailments that perhaps Delhiites could be witnessing, we have a whole battery of guests with us. We have Mr. Akshay Marathe, he's from the Aam Aadmi Party. We have Mrs. Vandana Shiva, who's an environmental activist. We have Mr. Gopal Sankaranarayanan, an advocate with the Apex Court, with the Supreme Court. We have Polash Mukherjee, who's joining us from the CSE. And finally, Mrs. Soumya Swaminathan, who's the DG ICMR. The first question, let's first go across to Mrs. Soumya Swaminathan. Ma'am, appreciate you joining us this evening. Again, we continue to see the smog, Delhiites battling smog conditions. Paint us for us a picture as to what the implications are. We're talking about these numbers here. They sound huge. PM 2.5 levels at 600 micrograms versus the safe levels of 25 micrograms. So these numbers by themselves sound huge. In real terms, as to how they're affecting us, how they're affecting you, what are the implications? What are the health conditions that Delhiites could be confronting, given that this is the second straight winter where we're having these terrible pollution conditions come back and make a return?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Obviously, it's something that is all of us need to be very concerned about, because what these levels of PM 2.5 really mean, these are the particles that actually are able to get right into our airways, and they in fact reach the blood and have a lot of effects on the body. We have both acute effects. You find increase in hospitalization, especially in young children and those who are vulnerable, with pneumonia, with exacerbation of lung diseases. People who have asthmatic go into acute attacks. There's also an association between spike in levels and admission for cardiovascular diseases. But what is also more concerning is the chronic effects, the long-term, rather silent and hidden effects of exposure to these levels of pollution have an effect not only on heart and lung disease, but also on susceptibility to diabetes and cancer. It's estimated that living in such conditions could actually shorten one's life by as much as about 6 years. So we really need to be concerned not only about acute effects in groups of people who already have pre-existing lung or heart disease, but really the long-term effects on all of us, children and adults alike.
I'll just ask you one more follow-up question as of now, that as you pointed out, this could have a whole range of concerns as far as health implications. The life of a person could be shortened by as much as 6 years. In fact, an interesting bit of data is that as far as India is concerned, India is responsible for the highest number of pollution-related deaths. That's pegged at 2.5 million deaths per annum. That's the kind of figure that we're looking at. Mrs. Swaminathan, if I may come back to you for one more question, that in your practice in the last few years, this is not a new phenomenon. We have been battling this for the last few years. The winters last year, in fact, was again off the mark in terms of pollution levels. Just the effects that we're already beginning to see as far as Delhi citizens and these chronic problems that you spoke of in terms of perhaps cancer being the extreme end, the other one being asthma. Are you beginning to already see these conditions become a part and parcel of a Delhiite's life, especially come winters?
Certainly, these diseases are becoming more common. And in fact, the ICMR is working with a network of hospitals in Delhi as well as in other metros and the Ministry of Environment to quantify the health impacts of pollution. And we have to remember that in India, there's a double burden. There's the outdoor air pollution or ambient pollution that we see around us today. But there's also a large number of people exposed to indoor air pollution because of the burning of solid fuels in their homes. Particularly for the rural areas, they're exposed to this double burden. And so we're actually doing this study across 20 metro cities where there's good data on ambient air pollution to see what the association is between health effects and air pollution. There are not too many studies that have been done in India, and most of the data we have is based on modeling. I think we really need to start documenting some of these so that we get real-time data, and then we can also look at the impacts. When we make changes and we're able to bring down levels of pollution, we should be able to then see clear health impacts.
And so clearly some disturbing trends there as far as Delhiites are concerned. So I'm looking at some gruesome conditions going forward as to what this could translate into in terms of real terms, in terms of what it could mean for your medical bills, what it could mean for your health. Let's take this conversation forward. Also joining us is Mr. Akshay Marathe from the Aam Aadmi Party. Coming to you now, Mr. Akshay, if you can hear me. There are some huge concerns that have been pointed out just by Mrs. Swaminathan. The concern here is that pollution at the end of the day is a very democratic killer. It doesn't quite distinguish between your political affiliations, between your economic realities, doesn't distinguish, hurts everyone equally. Just a sense as of now that despite the varied number of stakeholders, we're talking about a huge number of stakeholders here, the government, it seems, despite repeated winters where we see these pollution conditions come back, seems to have done little in terms of realizable gains instead of the ad hoc measures that we see every winters.
Thanks for having me on the show. Before I begin actually to answer your question, as a member of the Aam Aadmi Party, I would like to assure your viewers, especially those in Delhi, that your government is doing everything within our power to address this problem on a short-term basis as well as on a long-term basis. You're right, it is a democratic problem. It affects all of us equally. It doesn't matter how rich or poor you are. And therefore, it's also important not to point fingers at anyone. It's time for us to all come together despite any political rivalries, especially between whether it's Aam Aadmi Party, the BJP or the Congress.
I completely understand. I understand the comment that you're making about the need for all stakeholders to come together, and it is in light of that that I ask you that issues such as road dust control, which requires urgent action, and not just on an interim basis during winters, but throughout the year, measures such as enforcement of guidelines with respect to construction. What are the actions that perhaps we can take at this stage that will address the issue in the long term and not just as an ad hoc interim measure?
Absolutely. The government is taking several steps. I will come to them. But let me just point out that the problem that we are facing today is not necessarily the product of what we are doing in Delhi. It is a result of crop burning, as there is a general consensus, even on people on the panel would agree, that there is a general consensus that the source of this pollution, the source of this dark cloud that is hovering around North India is actually because of crop burning in the states of Punjab and Haryana. And while you're right, there is a serious problem even within Delhi, and it needs to be addressed over the long term. The immediate problem is because of the fumes that are being generated by burning of stubble on farms. And to that, to address that problem, the Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal has actually already written to CMs of Punjab and Haryana. He's asked for time from them to come together and sort out this problem. If there is a problem of finances, what is the subsidy that we're talking about? If farmers require any subsidy to deal with their stubble, what figures are we talking about? Can we take a proposal to the central government so that we can ensure that farmers do not have to burn their stubble again next year? So while you're right, Delhi does have a serious
That's an urgent point being made regarding
this current problem. Yeah.
So that's a fair point that you've made with respect to the sources of pollution being more widespread, not just being concentrated in Delhi. We will come back to you on the measures being employed in terms of road construction as far as pollution is concerned. But let me also just get across to Mr. Gopal Sankaranarayanan, an advocate with the Apex Court. Sir, if I'm audible to you at this stage, there are a number of concerns with respect to the sources of air pollution. That was one that was raised in terms of crop burning. We'll come to that. We'll address the issue. What are the other main measures? There are two key issues that were identified by the IIT Kanpur report. One was road dust. The other one was construction. Where are we lacking in terms of perhaps enforcement of the current rules and regulations to tackle the problem, at least home, as far as Delhi is concerned?
Well, I think the major problem has been that we have woken up to this issue, and when I say we, I mean the governments as well, wake up to this issue only when it's at its peak, which is like now. Even last year they woke up immediately after Diwali. I think it's necessary for the central government as well as the state governments of Delhi, Punjab, UP, etc. to wake up to this issue and have a permanent body which will implement long-term measures. There are multiple issues. The IIT Kanpur's draft report, which was submitted to the government of the NCT, dealt with, like you said, these few issues, but there are at least about a dozen of them. And with that, there are problems with evolving long-term solutions because the governments haven't done that yet. They've waited for the courts, the Supreme Court or the NGT as the case is, to suggest some measure and then to go ahead and implement it. So it's always been reactive. There's been nothing proactive. Even Mr. Kejriwal reaching out has been now. He should have reached out 6 months ago. For me, I think the major two issues are, one, the silence of those people sitting in that office over your shoulder. The central government, I'm shocked that with the kind of robust media coverage that this issue has received, with the streets being enveloped in smog, that the central government and the Prime Minister just remain absolutely silent about it. There's a huge arrogance, I think, that the central government has, that look, you voted us in, now we won't talk to you. I find that shocking. The second issue is that with the Punjab crop burning, it's heading towards Delhi and enveloping the cities here because nobody is consulting with the Met Department, which tells you when the winds are blowing towards Delhi. California does the exact same thing, but the California Air Pollution Board advises the farmers when they should be burning the crops. So there are actually days when you can burn it and it's not going to have this polluting effect. But there's no consultation, no discussion, and no action by the central government.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So two takeaways there from what Mr. Gopal was sharing with us, that we are more reactive than proactive and that perhaps there haven't been good enough consultations between the various stakeholders. Let me now come to Mrs. Vandana Shiva. Appreciate, ma'am, your patience with us. Just a question as of now, that we've discussed the fact that yes, we have acted too late. Yes, perhaps the consultations were not enough. And yes, perhaps we have been reactive, if not proactive. But going forward from here, what are the long-term measures that we need urgently to address this issue? We have three very clear issues, sources of pollution, the road dust, construction, as well as crop burning. What are the measures that we urgently need to adopt to tackle this pollution, this menace of air pollution?
Well, the first thing is what we call air pollution at the local level, at the planetary level, is what is called emissions. And it is now recognized that most emissions come from fossil fuels. They don't come from crop burning. They don't come only from localized construction. And I think one thing we have to overcome is the fragmentation. What's defined as Delhi's pollution problem is the global climate change problem driven by emissions beyond the planet's capacity to reabsorb the carbon, to reabsorb the nitrogen that's taking place in Bonn right now. That's the first fragmentation. The second fragmentation is an ecological fragmentation. I work in agriculture. I have watched Punjab that didn't burn stubble because they grew tall varieties of rice and wheat. Farmers went out and cut with a sickle. The straw went to feed the animals. The grain was eaten by humans. The Green Revolution said, no, we got to sell chemicals. This morning, I was giving the keynote at the World Organic Conference that is taking place in this city. We know organic is a solution. When you turn crops into dwarf varieties in order to absorb more chemicals, and then you bring combine harvesters driven by fossil fuels to take off the grain from the top, and you leave a stubble. The stubble burning is a result of a chemical agriculture which has destroyed Punjab's farmland. It has destroyed Punjab's water. It has destroyed Punjab's farmers who are either committing suicide because of debt or are riding a cancer train to Bikaner because of cancer. And it is destroying the future. We must revisit our model of development. We must stop worshipping fossil fuel and destroying our renewable energies.
For us
we must stop thinking.
The reasons that have contributed towards the problems of crop burning. If I may just take a minute here to actually come to Polash
Don't criminalize the Punjab farmer. He's a victim of a bad agriculture policy. Do not divert attention from the automobiles and the fossil fuels that are driving this pollution.
Indeed, those are concerns highlighted adequately by the IIT Kanpur report as well. We'll come to that in just a bit, but first, if I may just have a word with Polash Mukherjee. Polash, you've been working extensively as a part of diagnosing the problem at hand and then suggesting solutions. Going forward, to narrow it down to basically 3 issues that are contributing significantly to the pollution.
Would only ask Dr. Soumya to do a study on the difference between an upla burning and the burning of fossil fuels. I think that is the science that needs to be done. That's the science that needs to be done. Stop protecting a fossil fuel industry.
Indeed. Polash, coming back to you for just that one question, that when you look at the other sources of pollution as highlighted by the IIT Kanpur report, when you're looking at issues such as road dust, such as construction sites and how there has been little or no enforcement, where can we improve? Where can we work to ensure that at least these 2 areas, which are low-hanging fruits, we can pluck them and we can address these issues in the bud?
Firstly, let me quickly agree with my co-panelist Vandana Shiva.
Rewarding the real estate mafia, which can tear down good enough houses and build. It's a new problem, it's not an ancient problem.
Exactly. It's a new problem, and it's the top of the problem that's adding to the existing load that the city already has, which comes from, as rightly pointed out, from vehicles, from industry,
that's the point.
From construction dust. This is already existing around the year, and just during this part, the additional load that is temporal adds to it, and adding to the weather phenomena makes the effect of what we see in front of us. Going forward, what we need is 2 kinds of plans. Earlier this year, the MOEF notified something called the Graded Response Action Plan. Again, this was something that was initiated by the judiciary. It should have come from the executive. Notwithstanding, this is a very reactive plan. It is under this that odd and even is spoken about, is under this that hike in parking fees is spoken about. But these are all very reactive measures. What is required is a long-term plan with definite, clear targets and intervals at which checkpoints are set, where the government can check its status, whether it's achieving those targets or not. So this is something called the Comprehensive Action Plan, which is currently being debated in the courts right now. There's a hearing coming up on the 17th of November, and let me tell you, this is where the government is fighting us. The central government is fighting the EPCA on this very matter, on the setting of long-term targets for clean air, on deciding on what should be the way forward, whether diesel cars should be part of the government policy or not. These are the kind of steps that need to be looked forward. Coming back to the 2 sources that you specifically mentioned, road dust and construction. This is a problem of implementation. There are enough and more laws out there. We know that improper surfacing of roads creates more dust, which makes the road dust very toxic. I mean, when you mix road dust with the vehicular emissions, that's when it becomes really toxic and affects the affects the exposure of millions that are on the road every day. Same thing with construction. There are enough and more rules out there that say that you must use wind barriers, and construction trucks must be covered because otherwise the wind can blow around their contents very easily. But these are all things that need to be enforced very strongly by the authorities, which is the MCD, the state PWD and the NHAI. This is something that the government needs to do around the year and not just in the months of winter.
Fair enough. So some urgent takeaways there, that perhaps it's time that our strategy for tackling air pollution is not just reactive but rather proactive, and that there are enough rules and regulations already in place, but it requires urgent enforcement. On those questions of enforcement and perhaps what could the components be of a longer-term, broad-based strategy to tackle air pollution, we'll just take a short break. We'll come back and we'll discuss that with our panelists going forward, about the components of the strategy going forward, components of a proactive strategy going forward. Time now just for a short break. We'll be back in just a few seconds.